Greetings, boils and ghouls. I'm your host, Dr. Wolfula, with a new feature to the Tuesday rotation of vids, Crypt Tuesday, where I'll be reviewing episodes of HBO's original horror anthology TV series, Tales from the Crypt, aired from 1989 to 1996. Tales from the Crypt was one of HBO's earliest TV shows when the network was mostly just known for airing uncut movies and softcore porn. The show was based on the popular stable of EC Comics horror titles of the 1950s, with episodes primarily, of course, based on the flagship title Tales from the Crypt, but many episodes were actually inspired by stories from other EC Comics titles, like Vault of Horror, Haunt of Fear, and crime suspense stories, making the show more of an adaptation of EC Comics in general. In fact, most episodes of Tales from the Crypt Season 1 aren't even based on Tales from the Crypt stories. Only Episode 1, and technically that episode is based on a Crypt of Terror comic, the comic that would eventually become Tales from the Crypt. Now, EC Comics eventually ceased its popular line of horror and crime comics once the Comics Code Authority was established and went in full swing censoring any stories deemed inappropriate for kids instead of, leaving that stuff up to the discretion of parents properly supervising their children. So EC Comics head William Gaines switched his attention to humor magazines with Mad and corrupted America's youth in a different way that he could totally get away with. When HBO adapted Tales from the Crypt in 1989 for TV, the show could get away with a lot more than even the comics could at their peak. HBO was a premium subscription cable station and suffered from none of the same restrictions of basic cable TV programming, which meant that violence, gore, sex, nudity, and harsh language were all on the table to be shown.
Ugly bitch.
Hell yeah! There was a big boom in anthology TV programming in the 1980s with shows like Tales from the Dark Side, The Twilight Zone Revival, and even Freddy Krueger getting his own anthology show, but none of these shows, even Freddy's, could get away with content as harsh as what you could see in Tales from the Crypt. HBO's Tales from the Crypt was a huge hit for the network, starting its trend of boundary-breaking original programming. Hell, without Tales from the Crypt, you probably wouldn't have other TV shows that pushed the envelope, like Sopranos, Game of Thrones, and Stuart Little the animated series. Tales from the Crypt had an air of prestige to it that wasn't really seen in most TV shows at the time. The series had high production values for the 80s and 90s, even beating out the majority of horror movies released back then in quality. Tales from the Crypt episodes oftentimes had actual big film actors starring in episodes, like Demi Moore, Joe Pesci, and Ed Begley Jr., and Hollywood film directors helmed episodes, like Robert Zemeckis, Richard Donner, and even Arnold Schwarzenegger directed an episode. A little random.
Keep thumping. I tell the story.
The show really was the first of its kind on TV and even made its way to theaters with 2 spin-off films. Tales from the Crypt found a huge audience that only continued to grow past the show's run, even becoming popular with kids thanks largely to the show's host, the Crypt Keeper. Played by John Kassir, the Crypt Keeper was a ghoulish, zombified puppet that lived deep in a crypt beneath a derelict Gothic mansion, introducing and closing out the tales that episodes featured with a heavy dose of dark humor and prop work.
It slices it, dices it. Ooh.
The character was, of course, inspired by the Crypt Keeper of the Tales from the Crypt comics, but the host of the show was more of a pastiche of EC Comics' full trio of hosts, including Vault Keeper and the Old Witch. The appearance of the Crypt Keeper of the show may have also been inspired by the look of the creep from George Romero and Stephen King's film Creepshow, itself inspired by the EC Comics line. The Crypt Keeper's sense of humor had that later-day Freddy Krueger quality that made him a huge hit with children in the 90s, without the hang-ups of child molestation attached. Crypt Keeper's success with the youth market even spawned him a cartoon spin-off and repeated appearances hosting Kids WB, of all things.
Deck the halls with creepy crawlies.
Which brings us to talking about the first episode of the show finally, The Man Who Was Death. Directed by Walter Hill and starring William Sadler, an adaptation of the story of the same name from issue 17 of Crypt of Terror. The original comic was about an executioner named Edgar Bowman who relishes his job and somehow becomes world famous for his executions, but because of that, the crime rate went down out of fear and his services were no longer needed. Edgar decides to then take the law into his own hands instead of taking up a hobby City and goes around town electrocuting to death folks who got off scot-free in murder trials. The TV episode is a mostly faithful adaptation, but with some changes and necessary expansions, given the original comic was only 7 pages long. William Sadler plays Niles Talbot, a fourth-wall breaking executioner who loves frying suckers while narrating his work.
He's thinking about that rubber diaper they give him to wear. Wondering if he's gonna crap all over himself when I juice him in a couple minutes.
Unfortunately for Niles, a bill is passed that outlaws death by electric chair, and he's put out of a job.
Now listen, I've been working here a lot of years. I mean, 2 in an electric shop, another 12 throwing a switch for the state. Don't seniority count for something?
Niles only sees this as an obstacle keeping him from doing what he loves, so he attends murder trials where the perps are unjustly exonerated and targets them for his mysterious murders by electrocution, made to appear like accidents. The comic story is modernized for the 80s in the TV show, but mostly follows the original structure. The episode is very different in how it handles the main character and his victims, though. In the original comic, Edgar Bowman was this unsympathetic, bald-headed, beady-eyed Lex Luthor-looking fuck who was a bit two-dimensional, but as portrayed by William Sadler, Niles Talbot is a pretty sympathetic figure, a stand-up guy with strong opinions who happens to talk directly to the audience like he's on Malcolm in the Middle.
I like electricity. It's dependable.
There is that taxi driver aspect of something clearly being fucking wrong with Niles, but the performance of Sadler through his interior monologues makes him a likable character you could root for in his killing, especially given the drastic change in the depiction of the story's victims.
They canned me for my job because they're afraid of me. They're afraid of death.
The original comic had a moral ambiguity to it where the targets of Edgar's electrocutions were implied to actually be innocent of the murders they were charged for, and Edgar simply enjoyed the self-righteous thrill of killing through electrocution. Niles Talbot, on the other hand, is depicted more as an anti-hero. The targets of his electrocutions were definitely responsible for murders and got off on legal technicalities. Niles' victims are even shown to be totally unlikable scum. The first guy Niles killed is this biker who murdered a man for being gay.
You killed my brother!
Get the fuck back, boy! You know me. Your brother was a fag!
The other victims were a cheating couple where the guy killed his wife so he wouldn't have to get a divorce.
Oh, thank God.
The Man Who Was Death is still a really well-done episode, but seems like a strange choice to start the series off with, given its approach. It feels more like a gritty crime story in how it handles the material, taking away the horror of the original story of a psycho on the loose electrocuting innocent people. I mean, just don't commit hate crimes and adultery and you don't have to worry about Niles visiting you. The episode ends very much the same way as the original comic story, with Niles captured by police who stake out a strip club where Niles was stalking his next victim. But the episode adds an ironic twist. The death penalty by electrocution was reinstated, with Niles as the first to receive the honors.
Since you're such a staunch supporter of capital punishment, you'll be glad to know the state legislature has just reinstated the death penalty. And guess who's not pulling the switch this time?
So if Niles had just waited a bit longer, he could have had his whole job back, electrocuting people legit. Much like Edgar Bowman, Niles is put to death expressing fear like the inmates he once mocked, but with the belief that the governor would call and spare his life.
I told him, don't worry. The governor gonna call.
In both the original comic and the show, by putting an executioner in the shoes of someone being executed, it does bring to question the morality of putting criminals to death.
Many also claim that execution is still murder in the eyes of God.
Should that power be put in any man's hand, especially literally through electricity. The first episode, of course, also features host segments with the Crypt Keeper in his first TV appearance.
Our story is about a man with nobler ambitions.
Crypt Keeper is a bit more mellow and less punny than his later appearances, but he makes up for it by delightedly shocking himself in an electric chair in the closing segment.
Safety first!
The Man Who Was Death is overall a good start for Tales from the Crypt as a TV series, even if it doesn't quite nail the horror aspect. The episode is really well made, telling an entertaining noir tale featuring a fine performance by William Sadler. It's just missing the subtler aspect of the original comic that made it scary. I give it 4 Crypts out of 5. Before I go, as a bonus, I've recorded a video where I narrate the original comic that this episode was based on. It's up for folks who support me on Patreon. Link in the description if you're interested in helping the channel out and getting a little extra content. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, like it, and if you loved it, subscribe for more and click the bell icon to find out when my latest vids and streams go live. Want a double dose of Dr. Wolfula? Donate to my Patreon and you'll get bonus content for supporting the channel, including exclusive movie streams and commentaries weekly. I'd like to give a special thanks to my true Wolfulite supporters on Patreon and my channel memberships for their pledges. Their support helps keep the channel going after all these years. Thank you, guys. Alrighty, Dr. Wolfula signing out. See you all next time.